What's the most terrifying experience you've encountered in the woods? Story 1. I was backpacking with my dog and about 12 miles from the road and trailhead, so pretty far from people, though popular enough that other hikers might be around, even though we saw no one all day. Around 2 in the morning, my dog started this really low, deep growl and woke me up. I turned on my headlamp and saw his teeth showing and him positioned right on top of me. I then heard heavy footsteps, maybe a black bear or a moose, near the tent. I leashed my dog so he would not tear through the tent, and the footsteps moved farther away but kept circling my tent. All of my food and toiletries were hung in a tree in a bear bag, with nothing in the tent to draw a bear's attention. I clapped my hands, but something was still slowly circling. Not something a moose would do, and a bear might if it wanted food, but I had nothing and a really big dog with me. I decided to step out of the tent with the leash in one hand and bear spray in the other, yelling, "Hey, bear." The footsteps stopped. My dog's nose was in the air, telling me to look to the right, but there was nothing in my headlamp that I could see. I did not hear anything run off, but it was quiet. I waited about 5 minutes, got back in the tent, and it started again, slowly circling maybe 50 feet from me. Maybe an hour later, I heard the footsteps wander off into the woods. At dawn, I took the dog and the bear spray and started looking for tracks. I found a clear path in the leaves that had been trampled, but no tracks. My dog's nose was on the ground, and I followed his lead as he traced a loop around our campsite. We finally saw a few human footprints, not shoe tracks, just a regular size, not something huge, bare human foot. There was also, unfortunately, human waste and toilet paper. Someone had been wandering around the middle of nowhere near my tent, circling it for over an hour, and left that behind for me to find. Story 2. I have a honey hole about 3 miles deep into the national forest area where I hunt, and I usually get dropped off and hike in for a weekend. Hogs, white-tailed deer, black bears, and panthers are all in the area, and I have grown up around it, so there is not much I have not seen out there. Last November, I made the trek back in, set up my hammock, and got ready to camp for the night so I could hunt from sunrise to sunset. I laid down and maybe 10 minutes later heard the most blood-curdling screaming not far off. Bobcats, foxes, and limpkins can all sound like screaming, but this was different, and there was something about it that just did not feel right. I sat up, grabbed my binoculars, and started scanning the edge of the swamp. I caught a glimpse of what looked like the shape of a woman running full speed away from something about 200 yards out. Keep in mind, I was a good few hours' walk from a paved road, and even the service dirt road was a little over a mile behind me, and she was running in the exact opposite direction, where there was nothing but woods and eventually the river. I put down the binoculars and grabbed my rifle so I could use the scope in case she was being chased by a bear or panther, but I did not see a single thing. Absolutely nothing. I brushed it off as something my mind made up. The sun was setting, so I decided to get some rest and went to sleep, clutching my rifle a little tighter than usual. I woke up the next morning and decided to check the spot where I thought I saw her running and found small barefoot footprints in the mud. I packed my things up as fast as I could and left. I have not been back since. Story 3. I had a bear approach my tent one night while my girlfriend and I were sleeping during a 7-day through hike. When you are sleeping deep in the woods, it is common to hear small sounds that seem bigger than they are, and you sometimes worry about whether what you are hearing is a large animal. That night, there was absolutely no doubt that what I was hearing was a large animal, and it was coming straight for our tent. All of our food was hung in a tree nearby, but it must have smelled us. Not only did it come right up to the tent, but it started sniffing at the edge of it, and we could clearly hear it. At that point, we were still in our sleeping bags, and my girlfriend was completely terrified. I banged on the side of the tent and yelled as loudly as I could, and the bear ran off into the woods. A few minutes passed, and we heard it clomping through the brush, heading straight back toward our tent. Then there was more sniffing at the exact same corner as before. We yelled again, and it ran back into the woods. By that point, I had had enough, grabbed the bear spray, and climbed to my feet barefoot and completely naked, with only my headlamp and glasses on, since I had taken my contact lenses out before sleeping. I got out of the tent as quickly as I could and immediately saw its eyes reflecting in the distance. When you are wearing a headlamp, animal eyes reflect straight back at you as two bright points. I picked up a stick, hurled it in its direction while yelling, and it ran off. This all happened on a section of the Pacific Crest Trail in Washington. I was deep in the wilderness, but there were other campers at the lake nearby, and to my surprise, they started cheering for my awkward naked sprint. Story 4. Many years ago, when I was about 14, I was hiking deep in the woods behind my house with some friends. We were miles away from home, farther than any of us had ever gone before. We came to the edge of a clearing, and a little farther down the tree line, we saw what looked like a pile of clothes underneath an old deer stand. We got closer and could make out legs, arms, and boots. They were wet from rain and looked like they had been there for a while. Our first thought was that it was a hunter who had an accident, fallen from the stand, and died. We were completely shaken, and it took a while to work up the nerve to get a closer look. It was not until we were almost on top of it that we realized it was a dummy. We had wandered up to the edge of a large Christmas tree farm's property, and the dummy was part of decorations from a haunted hayride they used to run. They must have forgotten about it when they closed for the year. We laughed afterward, but for a few minutes we were absolutely terrified. Story 5. My husband, our child, and I live in the middle of nowhere on a plot of land that is about 100 acres. I would say roughly 95 of those acres are wilderness with all-terrain vehicle and hiking trails that we, along with several previous owners, created by exploring. We use the land for camping, hiking, and hunting, and we like to find a spot, clear it a bit, and camp overnight. There is so much space that we have never stayed in the same place twice. We have seen old and fresh kill sites, lots of animal tracks, and places where deer bed down. I have even spent a lot of time hiking alone while our child is in school and my husband is at work, and whether alone or together, we always carry a firearm for protection. A few weeks ago, we loaded up our camping gear and started cutting a new trail, marking it with spray paint on trees. We were deep in the woods, having hiked almost an hour, when the atmosphere suddenly changed. I am not sure who noticed it first, but my husband, who was leading us, turned around and gave me a concerned look. The birds had stopped chirping, the insects were quiet, and there were no sounds around us, which is rarely a good sign in the woods. We continued on, fully alert, while our child kept chatting happily. When we reached the stream that marks the midway point of our property, we stopped for a moment, my husband and I exchanging a long look, both feeling that something was wrong, but not wanting to scare our daughter. I finally said that I did not feel well and that we should head home, and my husband immediately agreed despite our child's protests. We turned back, and after walking a few hundred yards through the same silence, I looked to my right and saw a person crouched in a ghillie suit about 150 feet off the trail. I am certain they noticed that I saw them, but they never moved. I cleared my throat to get my husband's attention, and when he looked back, I placed my hand on the gun at my hip, prompting him to adjust his rifle. We hurried back home, and I told him everything once we were inside. We called the police and reported the trespasser, filed a report, and were told to call again if we saw anyone. A few days later, my husband and I went out alone and set up several trail cameras. About a week later, we retrieved the footage, and out of 9 cameras, 2 captured images of a person in a ghillie suit. We handed copies to the police to add to the report. We have not gone back into the woods since, except to check the cameras, and we have not seen anyone else. What unsettles me the most is thinking about the times we heard footsteps near our tent at night and assumed it was wildlife, because now I am not so sure. Story 6. I was camping on the Deschutes River by myself one night. It was the middle of the week, so I had the campground entirely to myself, with no other human being within 5 miles. I drank a few beers as the sun went down in the canyon. It was a cloudy night with no stars and no moon, and there were no campfires since it was well into fire season, which combined with the clouds made it essentially pitch black. It was dark and no one could see me, so I put on some headphones and started dancing around my campsite like a carefree hippie when my nose caught a faint whiff of something awful. I took off my headphones and heard nothing, and before I could turn my headlamp on, I heard a loud thundering of hooves or feet or paws, felt a massive rush of wind about 2 feet in front of my face, and then a heavy crash into the bushes next to my campsite. Before whatever had jumped through the bushes even hit the ground, I ran to my truck, climbed into the back, laid down, and locked all the doors. I did not move for the rest of the night, slept in my vehicle, and held several beers worth of needing to pee until daylight. When I woke up in the morning, all I could see was a small bit of blood on the tongue of my boat trailer, some kind of prints in the dirt, and a massive hole in the bushes next to my camp that was about 5 feet in diameter. To this day, I have no idea what happened. My best guess is that a deer wandered into the campsite and saw me dancing without a care in the world, then got startled when I stopped moving and bolted into the bushes, possibly nicking itself on the trailer as it jumped over it. I do not think my life was ever in danger, but it was terrifying, and not knowing exactly what it was makes it even worse. Story 7. I was backpacking the Maryland and Pennsylvania section of the Appalachian Trail around the age of 17. Four of us were sleeping under a tarp tied up with paracord, so we only had protection from the rain. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of branches breaking and movement nearby, which was nothing out of the ordinary. Since that time of year, the worst it could be was a lone, curious black bear, and they usually do not pose much of a threat. The sound started getting closer and more rhythmic, clearly something walking. I turned on my side to see if I could spot anything, and as the walking got closer, I started to see leaves moving with nothing visible causing it. I could clearly hear a person walking toward us and eventually moving around our makeshift shelter. I was completely panicked and lay in total silence for what felt like an eternity until my friend next to me finally whispered that he had heard it too. I nearly jumped out of my sleeping bag, but it confirmed that I had not imagined the entire thing. I still have no explanation and am half convinced it was some kind of shared hallucination. On a non-paranormal note, and far scarier than anything above, I was stalked by a mountain lion in the Rocky Mountains a few years later. The unease that slowly turns into full terror when you realize what is happening, and the effort it takes to fight every instinct not to run, is a unique experience. That primal realization that you are prey is absolutely terrifying. Story 8. A roommate of mine went through several rough months all at once, dealing with health issues, school stress, relationship problems, and family trouble. He decided to go on a hike to some waterfalls outside of Tucson, Arizona, and take mushrooms to do some soul searching and reflection. The hike in and out from the falls involved a steep hill, except right before the parking area, where there was a 15-foot cliff with stairs cut along the face. As he was hiking out, he got the sudden feeling that he was being watched. He stopped, scanned the area, and locked eyes with a small mountain lion about 40 feet away across a narrow ravine between two hills. He later said he nearly lost control of himself and had to focus intensely to avoid sprinting back to the truck. Keeping his eyes on the animal, he slowly worked his way up the hill. As he crept along to the right, still watching the cat in front of him, he heard a branch snap behind him. Expecting to see another hiker, he turned and shouted a warning, but instead he saw a second, much larger mountain lion about 20 feet uphill behind him. He was now trapped between two mountain lions, with one closer to his truck than he was, and without the advantage of higher ground. He picked up a large rock and continued creeping forward, focusing mostly on the larger cat while keeping track of the smaller one. He eventually managed to position himself uphill of the larger cat, which stayed crouched and followed him. When he reached the stairs, he realized he had lost sight of the smaller lion and feared it might be in the parking area, but he had no other way out. Watching the larger cat closely, he backed up the stairs, reached the truck only a few feet away, and finally saw the smaller cat moving back toward the ravine and the other lion. He got into the truck, left immediately, and drove down the mountain, only then allowing himself to fully feel the panic attack that had been building while he was still coming down from the mushroom experience. Story 9. My son was 18 months old and strapped to my chest in a carrier when we went on our weekly walk into the woods outside of town around 7 in the morning. I was about 2 miles in when I started hearing heavy movement to my right, maybe 30 yards away, something large pushing through the underbrush, though I could not see it. I assumed it was a deer or a hog and kept moving, not too concerned until I realized we were being followed. For about 20 minutes, we continued down the trail, my son against my chest, while the same heavy movement kept pace with us. I let the dog off the leash in case we needed to move quickly. When the path turned sharply to the right around a bend in the trees, I saw a fully grown mountain lion standing on the trail about 25 yards in front of me. It turned its large body toward me and looked straight at me, and I froze in shock and fear. We made eye contact for a moment, and when it finally turned its head away, I began backing up slowly. The dog was behind me on the trail and had not seen the lion at all. I continued walking backward until I was around the bend and out of its sight, then turned and moved as fast as I could out of the woods. It took about 20 minutes of fast movement to reach safety, all while listening for something large following us and not knowing if we were being pursued. Those were the most terrifying 20 minutes I have ever experienced in any forest, and it took me months before I was able to go back there again. Story 10. I brought my son, who was 10 years old, on a remote camping and fishing trip, easily a 4-hour drive from the nearest town. We set up camp, and he wanted to have a quick dinner before going fishing that evening, so we made hot dogs over the fire and had some trail mix. I had absolutely no idea that my child was allergic to cashews, no clue at all, and there had never been any issues before. I even swear I had seen him eat cashew butter snack bars in the past. Not long after eating, he went into an anaphylactic reaction. As soon as he said he was not feeling well, and I saw swelling forming on his lip, we packed up immediately. I gave him an antihistamine and had him start drinking water, but his breathing became very heavy and labored, and he started coughing uncontrollably. I drove across the lake as fast as my small 8-horsepower outboard motor would go, doing everything I could to keep him calm. I portaged the boat with pure adrenaline, got him to the truck, and started driving out of the bush. By then his swelling had begun to go down and his breathing was less harsh. We made it to the hospital where he was given a steroid injection, the name of which I cannot remember, and the staff scolded me for giving him something he was allergic to, as if I could have known. That was the most terrified I have ever been while out in the wilderness. Story 11. About 10 years ago, I was out hunting, sitting in a stand roughly a quarter mile from the nearest road, surrounded by dense trees and brush. It was getting dark, and while there was still some light, it was not enough to see clearly, so I decided to climb down and start walking up the game trail I had used earlier, while I could still make it out. I had gone about 100 yards when I heard a horrible sound off to my right, not far from the trail. Something like a mix between a baby crying and a woman screaming. The woods had been nearly silent, and the sudden noise was piercing. Immediately after the scream, brush about 10 yards from me shook violently, and whatever made the sound took off through the woods along the trail in the direction I had just come from. I never actually saw it, only the brush moving as it ran. My rifle was instantly raised, my mind racing, and I moved up the trail as fast as I could manage, weapon ready in case it came back. When I reached the road where my four-wheeled vehicle was parked, I jumped on and tried to start it, only for it to refuse to turn over. At that point, I was more frustrated than scared, thinking I was about to die in the most predictable horror movie way possible. After several long minutes, it finally started, and I raced back to camp. Later, after talking with the other hunters, I learned it had almost certainly been a bobcat. They are generally harmless to humans, but their screams are absolutely terrifying, something I learned the hard way during my first encounter. Story 12. A few years ago, I went camping with a group of friends for one of their birthdays at a national park in the United States. We set up camp near a hiking trail and decided to go for a short hike before cooking dinner. After about an hour, we returned hungry and started preparing food when I suddenly heard a loud clapping sound. I looked over and saw an elderly man around 70 years old who had just punched my friend directly in the face, sending his glasses flying several feet away. When I made eye contact with the man, he began shouting that he was Jesus Christ and demanded a fight. My friend who had been punched was in shock. Another friend froze in fear, and I reacted by tackling the man to the ground and holding him there. While restraining him, I told my other friend to call the police, who then connected him with park rangers. About 20 minutes later, law enforcement arrived, and one of them casually said that it was the same man again. They arrested him and explained that he frequently came out there because he believed the stars were going to fall and destroy the earth, and that he often stopped taking his medication. It was by far one of the most frightening experiences we have had, made even more unsettling by the fact that it was the punched friend's birthday. Story 13. About 15 years ago, I was hiking in the Himalayas as part of a group of around 30 people. We would trek all day and set up camp at sunset, repeating the routine daily while slowly acclimating and gaining altitude. All the camps were designated sites, and as we climbed higher, they were fenced and even guarded by the army. Around the fifth day, I developed a bad stomach issue, and in the middle of the night, I had to step out, so I asked a friend to come with me. We walked toward the watchtower where an army guard was sleeping under a thick blanket, but he did not wake, so we quietly unchained the gate and stepped outside. The sky was incredibly clear, and the Milky Way was fully visible. I relieved myself near a glacier that had carved a path through the forest long ago. The moment felt surreal, with the clean air, pristine surroundings, and stars overhead. We talked quietly about the sky and returned to our tent, only to hear a whistle moments later as the night guard woke up. We had been warned that no one was to leave their tents after lights out, so we panicked slightly and stayed silent as someone walked around our tent. The next morning there was chaos, with a high-ranking army officer scolding the entire group. Someone had left the camp gate open, and a bear had wandered through the site during the night, leaving tracks all around, including near our tent. My friend and I exchanged looks, realizing how close we had come to real danger, and never admitted our mistake. That night taught me lasting respect for the wilderness, even though at the time we had no idea how serious the situation truly was. Story 14. I was solo backpacking in September in grizzly bear country, a time when bears are in a state of hyperphagia, meaning they are aggressively feeding in preparation for hibernation and can behave unpredictably. I was exploring off-trail lakes about 13 miles from the trailhead, and on my hike I noticed multiple sets of bear tracks and fresh droppings, making it clear that bears were nearby. As long as proper bear safety is followed, this is usually manageable, and unhabituated bears tend to avoid humans if you make enough noise. I set up camp at a beautiful lake late in the afternoon and then hiked to another nearby lake, about 3/4 of a mile away, to take sunset and night sky photographs. The experience was peaceful, aside from thick wildfire smoke rolling in over the mountains, which is common during fire season in Montana. As the smoke intensified, I realized my headlamp light was reflecting off the particles, reducing visibility to about 10 or 15 feet, like walking through dense fog. After finishing my photography, I noticed my headlamp was dimming and realized I had no spare batteries. I packed up quickly and started back toward camp. As I crested the hill between the lakes and aimed my headlamp toward my tent, the beam reflected off two sets of eyes. My heart skipped multiple beats as I immediately thought of a mother bear and cub, which would be extremely dangerous. I began shouting to announce my presence and prepared my bear spray and sidearm while moving slowly toward the faint glow of my tent light. With visibility nearly gone and my headlamp fading, I scanned constantly, afraid the animals might be waiting nearby. I eventually reached my tent safely but barely slept that night, shaken by how vulnerable I had felt in the dark wilderness. Story 15, I was hunting while staying alone in a small rustic log cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was set up like a semi-detached house and could accommodate two small groups of hunters, basically two 10 by 10 rooms, each with a small dining table and two twin beds. There was no running water or electricity, only a small propane lamp for light. I arrived alone late in the afternoon and noticed a car already parked nearby, so I assumed my neighbors had arrived before me. I unpacked my gear and then cracked open a cold beer while sitting on the front porch as the sun was nearly gone. I noticed there was no light coming from my neighbor's only door, so I figured they had not yet returned from hunting. Then it started. I heard a grown man crying loudly, like he had lost a family member or had just been abandoned. It was intense and nonstop, and I immediately felt awful and had no idea what to do. Then it hit me that we were in the middle of nowhere, and the only reason to be out there was hunting, which meant he was almost certainly armed. The crying went on for a good 15 minutes and did not slow down. My thoughts spiraled and I started worrying he might hurt himself or even go on a violent rampage. I retreated into my room, closed the door, and deliberately made noise so he would know someone else was there and maybe calm down. It worked, and the crying stopped. I started cooking dinner, but as I sat down to eat, I heard new sounds coming from next door. I realized he was not alone and was with a woman, and they began having extremely loud S, though it sounded aggressive and unsettling rather than intimate. I felt deeply uncomfortable knowing they were aware of my presence and did not care at all. To clear my head, I grabbed my camera and tripod and walked away for a while to take photos of the night sky. Thankfully, another vehicle arrived not long after. It was a group of hunters staying in a separate nearby cabin who had arrived late. They invited me in for a drink, and I told them everything that had happened. They insisted I stay with them for the night. The next morning, the strange neighbors were gone. A maintenance worker I spoke to later told me they had checked out early and mentioned that he had been the one who registered them, adding that he had never seen such an odd couple before. Story 16. I was backpacking in Yosemite around 2005 or 2006 with a group of about 10 people. I have always been the type to scan my surroundings, half hoping to spot something paranormal or monstrous watching us. We were hiking uphill alongside a stream with dense woods to our left. I was not paying attention to the trail ahead and instead kept staring through the trees. In a small clearing between the trunks, I noticed an open field and a flash of red. I broke formation and started pushing through the trees toward the clearing. As I got closer, with only a few thick trees left before the opening, I could clearly see a figure about 7 feet tall standing motionless in the middle of a bright green field, draped in a silky red cloak. I yelled back to the group and everyone slowly moved toward me, though some stopped farther back. We stood there staring at it for quite some time before I removed my pack and cautiously walked toward it, with one or two others following. From a distance it was hard to describe, but it was deeply unsettling and felt like more than it appeared. Eventually we realized it was a rotting taxidermy bear that someone had hauled up there and dressed in a bright red Riding Hood-style cloak. Despite the reveal, it remains one of my favorite and most surreal backpacking experiences. Story 17. In the summer of 2014, my dad and I decided to go camping on the Standing Indian Mountain in North Carolina. We had passed through the area once while hiking the Appalachian Trail and were fascinated by the Native American myths and legends surrounding the mountain, so we decided to return and stay a while. We reached a clearing near the summit, set up camp before dusk, started a fire, ate dinner, secured our food and gear in a nearby tree, and crawled into the tent. We spent a couple of hours playing cards when suddenly everything went silent. No insects, no animals, no background noise at all. My dad and I exchanged a look and instinctively grabbed the weapons we had brought. I had a combat axe from my time in the army, and he had his entrenching tool. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then we heard a heavy thud followed by tumbling sounds, as if something large had been thrown toward us. We made noise, assuming it was an animal, but there was no response. After a few more tense minutes, we worked up the courage to unzip the tent and step out. We moved slowly toward the fire between us and the tree line, stoking it and adding logs while constantly scanning our surroundings. I went back into the tent to grab a flashlight and started inspecting the area. Our food and gear were still hanging untouched, but less than 15 feet from the fire sat a massive rock that had not been there before. What made it unsettling was that rocks of that size were located about 30 feet away near the tree line, and this one was far too large for a grown man to throw more than a few feet. Even stranger, we were camped uphill from the tree line, making it impossible for the rock to have rolled toward us. My dad believes it may have been a Sasquatch or one of the so-called mountain men rumored to inhabit the area. While there is no proof such beings exist, he has never wavered in his belief. After that night, I started researching similar incidents and found multiple reports describing nearly identical experiences. The Appalachian Mountains are considered some of the oldest in the world and are said to hide many secrets, including unexplored cave systems and unexplained creatures. Before that night, I would have dismissed such ideas entirely, but now I am far more open-minded and still wish I had a clear explanation for what we experienced. Story 18. I am not really an outdoorsy person, but I wanted to share my story. When I was in the 5th grade, around 10 years old, I was a girl who spent a lot of time outside with friends. We would walk a fair distance from our houses to a small patch of woods surrounded by farmland. The woods sat in the middle of cornfields, but at that time of year, the corn was dead, flattened, and easy to walk through. We would often see deer and wild turkeys, which felt exciting to us as little tomboys. We used to hang out in those woods completely oblivious to the fact that there was a very obvious hangout spot someone else had made. There was an old couch that looked like someone might sleep on it, possibly a homeless person, and we would occasionally find what clearly looked like human waste on the ground. We did not really care and kept exploring because the area was huge. One day my best friend, who was 11, and I were walking back through the surrounding field when two boys our age suddenly ran toward us screaming. I could make out one of them yelling that someone was trying to kill us and that he was going to hit us. They were still far away and it was hard to understand clearly, but then I heard what sounded like a motorcycle engine. I turned and saw a boy on a three-wheeler driving straight toward me. I froze completely and could not move at all. My friend ran toward the boys to get away, while I stood petrified in the open field. I saw the boy's face as he came closer, and his eyes looked completely empty. He hit me and snagged my left leg, sending my body flying sideways and sliding along the ground like I was diving into a base. The boy on the three-wheeler disappeared, and the other boys ran to me. One of them recognized me from school and noticed blood on my shoe, pulling up my pant leg to reveal a deep gash. The next thing I remember, my mom was there, and I was rushed to the hospital where my leg was stitched up. I later found out that the boy who hit me had special needs, and that his cousin, a boy named Mikey, who had a crush on me that I did not return, had sent him after me to hurt me. Mikey was angry that I would not be his girlfriend and had deliberately tried to scare or injure me. He had a rough reputation in our area, and I still wonder if he was the one who had been camping in those woods and watching us. Years later, Mikey died by suicide, which was a sad shock, and I still carry a scar on my leg from that day. Story 19. Sometime last year, I went on a date with a girl who was in my country on a university exchange program. I wanted to take her somewhere meaningful to me, so I chose a walking trail about a 30-minute drive from my house. By the time we arrived, the sun was already starting to set, but I had walked this trail at night many times before. It is a well-known place with a clearly defined loop path that takes around 2 hours to complete, so I knew it would be dark halfway through. The first part of the walk was pleasant and uneventful. When we reached a section halfway in, the sun had fully set, and because of the dense tree cover, it became pitch black with no moonlight coming through. As we walked, we heard branches snapping in the tree line, which I assumed were just animals. A few minutes later, I was suddenly hit with a strong smell of gasoline, which made no sense given how isolated the trail is. We both noticed it, and as we continued walking, everything went silent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, something that had never happened to me before. Neither of us spoke, and she squeezed my hand tightly as we moved through the dark section without saying a word. Eventually, the normal sounds of nature returned, and the feeling lifted. We finished the loop and made it back to my car, both of us acknowledging how unsettling the moment had been. Nothing actually happened, but it remains one of the creepiest experiences I have ever had. Story 20. I was about 21 years old at the time and living in Arizona, where I had recently gotten into hiking and would often head into the Superstition Mountains without much planning. One day I decided to attempt my first solo overnight hike to a waterfall. The drive took longer than expected, and I arrived at the trailhead with only a few hours of daylight left. I hiked for a while and then set up my tent to sleep. There were only 2 other cars at the trailhead, and I had not seen anyone else on the trail. As I lay down, I heard something scratch the side of my tent. I assumed it was an animal and that it would leave, but it made me nervous and I stayed awake. After about 30 to 45 minutes, I heard another sound on the gravelly ground, like a single footstep coming from the left side of my tent, then another from the right. 10 minutes later, it happened again, left then right, perfectly spaced. It kept repeating, and I became convinced there were 2 people outside. It was completely dark, and I stayed still inside the tent, holding a knife in one hand and a handgun in the other, weapons I had brought at a friend's insistence. I did not move or make a sound, thinking that whoever was outside might not know who or how many people were in the tent. I told myself that if I heard it one more time, I would fire a warning shot. When the footsteps came again, I fired blindly through the tent. My ears rang for several minutes, and everything went silent for about 45 minutes before the footsteps returned, following the same pattern. I fired again, As time passed, fear turned into anger, and I accepted the thought that I might not make it through the night. I stayed frozen in place until I heard footsteps from both sides at once, still spaced apart, and I fired another shot. After that, the sound stopped completely. I sat in the same position until sunrise, eventually stepping out to find no clear footprints. I packed up and finished the hike, passing one other hiker along the way. I have never backpacked alone again, and to this day I do not believe it was just my imagination, even though I may never know what was really out there. Story 21. I was winter camping with some friends when we crossed paths with another group. One person from their group walked out onto a beaver pond, and we immediately warned him to get off the ice because it was not safe. Moments later, we heard a loud crack, and he went straight through. The ice flipped, and he was trapped under it, wearing a full pack and snowshoes. We organized a rescue using our skis to distribute weight, and one of our group, Don, started crawling out toward him when the man suddenly surfaced. Don helped pull him out of the water, though I did not see that part because I was preparing supplies for once he was out. I, along with another from our group and two from theirs, got a tent set up and two stoves going with hot liquids. We stripped him out of his soaked clothes and got him into a sleeping bag, giving him warm water shortly after. We thought he was safe, so we continued our trip and skied about 4 more hours to our planned camp at the base of a mountain. Overnight, the wind picked up and temperatures dropped dramatically. We estimated it was around 0 degrees Fahrenheit with strong wind, and although we nearly reached the summit the next day, we turned back due to ice and wind. That night was the coldest winter camping experience of my life, with 5 of us shivering in a tent as we heard trees cracking from the cold. We later learned the temperature was likely around 40 degrees below zero. When it warmed to about 10 degrees on our way out and eventually reached 20, we passed the beaver pond again and found the other group still there. The man's wet fleece was frozen solid on the ground, his pack was at the bottom of the pond, and because he was over 6'5" with no spare clothes, he had stayed naked inside a sleeping bag. The other 2 men had shared one sleeping bag, burned all their fuel, and were severely hypothermic when we reached them again, unable to speak. Dawn rushed down the mountain for help while the rest of us fired up stoves, made hot drinks, and gave them all our sweets. About an hour later, snow machines arrived with Don smiling on the back, and the Rangers bundled the 3 men into rescue sleds and sped them to safety. While I was never personally in danger, I was terrified for those 3 men. Story 22. I was about 16 years old, hunting along a creek that ran through our farm in south-central Missouri. Because the creek sat at the bottom of a valley, once the sun dropped below the hillside, all light disappeared. At the time, I only had a flip phone and a tiny button light meant to illuminate the fiber optic pins on my sight, just enough to avoid stepping into a hole, but not enough to light up nearby trees. There were 2 cleared paths that converged at the creek crossing where my truck was parked, and as I approached, I heard something breaking branches in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I stopped and aimed my small light toward the sound, and the only thing I could see were 2 glowing eyes reflecting back at me. Both the animal and I froze. My heart was pounding as I watched the eyes blink but stay locked on me. I nocked an arrow, realizing I had never thought I would need a sidearm in that area. I started yelling and making noise, though my voice shook badly from adrenaline. The animal took a few quick steps toward me and stopped just before the tree line, halting when it saw I did not move. I ran across the creek and into my truck as fast as I could, even though you are never supposed to run because it can trigger a predator instinct. I got home shaking and breathless, and no one believed what I thought I had seen. The next day, neighbors checked their cameras and confirmed there was a mountain lion on them, the first sighting in 15 years. From that point on, I never went evening hunting without a powerful flashlight and a pistol. Story 23. I was in my early teens, and since both my parents worked nights, I was often sent to my grandmother's acreage in the country after school or on weekends. There was nothing to do there except watch television or play solitaire on her ancient computer, so I spent most of my time exploring about 10 acres of unmanaged woodland, as long as I was inside by dark. One autumn evening, I stayed out later than I should have, and while heading back, I heard something snap out of sync with my own footsteps. The light was fading fast, and what remained was shining straight into my eyes as I turned to look. Catching a glimpse of something canine, which my brain labeled as a coyote, I continued walking home carefully, stopping whenever the sounds behind me seemed closer, until I could finally see the lights of my grandmother's house through the trees. I was deeply uneasy, barely able to see my feet, armed with nothing but a stick and no light. When I broke the tree line, nothing followed me, and I went inside. After a brief scolding, my grandmother told me to take the dogs out before dinner. I took them into the fenced yard with a flashlight, waiting while they wandered. When one dog, Duchess, disappeared toward the back near the woods, I went to retrieve her and found her standing rigid and growling at the fence. I swept my light outward and caught a glimmer, then focused the beam to reveal two massive gray wolves standing motionless about 30 yards away. I knew the difference between dogs and wolves, and these were huge. I grabbed Duchess, kept the light on them, backed toward the house, then ran inside once I cleared the corner. My grandmother dismissed it as imagination, but the next morning my mother humored me by checking the area, where we found large canine tracks far too big to be from dogs. From then on, I was forbidden from wandering the woods. Officially, there are no wolves where I lived, but I know what I saw, and the mix of fear, awe, and confusion from that day still stays with me. Story 24. This is not my own story, but one told to me by a close family friend, and it happened roughly 10 years ago. He and his father, who was in his late 20s at the time, were hunting deep in the Idaho wilderness, which is most of the state, and strange things kept happening throughout the trip. They were moving up through a narrow draw, hoping to funnel deer into an easier hunting area, when they noticed the forest became unnaturally silent, even more so than usual, with no birds, no wind, and no ambient noise at all. As they pushed farther in, they began to notice a foul smell that was not overwhelming at first but was clearly present. The farther they went, the stronger the smell became, along with an intense feeling that something was watching them. At one point, they heard what he described as a horribly distorted scream in the distance, something that did not sound human, but also did not resemble any animal either of them had encountered in all their combined years outdoors. They continued hearing the sound intermittently, each time seeming a little closer, until eventually both the noise and the smell stopped, making them think they had passed whatever it was. Suddenly, the sound returned along with movement in the brush, and a doe burst out in front of them, stopping about 15 feet away. He said the look in its eyes was pure terror, and when it saw them, it almost looked relieved, as if recognizing them as the lesser threat, before sprinting past. As it ran by, an overwhelmingly rotten and putrid smell surrounded them, strong enough to make them nearly vomit. Then the same scream erupted again, this time seeming to come from all directions at once, even above them, and it felt angry, as if it knew they were there. They immediately ran, scrambling out of the draw while the screams, the smell, and the sound of heavy movement crashing through brush followed close behind. Once they escaped the draw, whatever it was stopped pursuing them. To this day, they refuse to return to that area, even to pass through it. And although I cannot personally verify the story, the fear in their eyes when they told it convinced me they truly experienced something terrifying. Story 25. A few years ago, I was camping on a friend's land in Louisiana with two other friends, and we had been there for a couple of days with camp fully set up. After dark, my friends went to gather more firewood while I stayed behind tending the dying fire with what little kindling remained. About 15 minutes passed in complete silence when, down the hill near the tree line about 50 feet away, I heard an unnatural screech and saw foliage moving as I swung my flashlight toward the sound. Almost immediately, it screeched again and ran along the tree line just beyond the reach of my light. Though I could clearly track the movement through branches and brush, I could hear it crashing and stomping through the woods, and as I ran after it, my friends were heading back toward camp, shouting my name because they thought I was the one screaming in distress. We met in the middle of the path, and they also saw the brush shaking and heard the creature screech one final time as it veered away from us and disappeared deeper into the woods. We were all certain it was not a bobcat or a cougar, since we had heard those before, and based on the sound of its footsteps, it seemed large and moving on two legs. It is possible it was a person behaving erratically, which can happen in that part of Louisiana, but even now we are not sure what it was. There are some very strange things in those swamps and bayous. Story 26. I was on a very remote northern reservation with a friend from high school in mid-January, visiting his family while we went ice fishing. On the third day, one of his uncles went missing while checking his snares a few miles away from the reservation. He was supposed to return around 5 in the evening, and by about 8 we realized he might not be coming back. Early the next morning, as the sun came up, 6 of us loaded our sleds and headed toward the area where he usually set his traps. We found his sled, which would not start, along with wolf tracks, and eventually located him nearby up in a tree calling for help. He explained that wolves had been hanging around his snares stealing rabbits, and when he tried to leave his sled, would not turn over. So he spent the night in a tree hoping someone would realize he was stranded. That part alone was unsettling, but the truly eerie moment came after we lit a fire to warm up before heading back. Once the fire was put out, we began hearing howling in the distance, maybe a quarter mile away. A few of us had rifles and prepared ourselves, and as we rode away, we could see several wolves moving through the trees. The next morning, about 8 of us returned fully armed to retrieve his sled. It was not outright terrifying, but knowing we were being watched by hungry predators in such a remote place was deeply unsettling. Story 27. When I was a teenager, I went on a hitchhiking trip around Europe, and around the 10th day, I remember waking up, reflecting on how far we had come, and thinking to myself that everything had been amazing and we had not had a single problem. That thought felt like a mistake almost immediately, because the rest of the day was filled with uncomfortable situations. We eventually found ourselves outside Nottingham at a busy and fairly upscale rest stop. We had our hearts set on going to Sherwood Forest, fully aware that Robin Hood is more legend than historical fact. But oddly enough, none of the drivers who stopped for us seemed to know where Sherwood Forest was, almost as if they had never heard of it. After waiting for hours, we started considering camping at the rest stop, even though it felt unsafe. We had a strict rule about stopping hitchhiking once it got dark, but that night we broke it. A man in his 30s pulled over in a dark sedan and asked where we were headed. When we said Sherwood Forest, he replied that he did not know where it was, but promised to get us there. We also had a rule about never putting our backpacks in the trunk so we could run if needed, but out of desperation we broke that rule too. I sat in the front passenger seat and my female friend sat in the back. After some small talk, he suggested we stay at his place for the night instead, offering food and a place to sleep. I checked the mirror and saw my friend slowly shaking her head, so I declined. He asked again a few minutes later, then again after that, offering meals, showers, and laundry, and each time we refused. Eventually, he picked up his phone and told someone that he had picked up 2 hitchhikers, one male and one female, and that he was bringing them over. He then drove into an area of Nottingham filled with police cars and ambulances and parked near an apartment block, again asking us to come inside. While he went in, we debated running away despite our bags being locked in the trunk. After several tense minutes, he returned carrying juice boxes and large map books. It turned out he was a volunteer at a hospital, a deeply religious man, and genuinely kind. He drove us for nearly an hour and dropped us off near Sherwood Forest, not really knowing where the entrance was. It was completely dark, likely close to midnight. We followed a small road into the forest, pitched our tent, and crawled inside. Not long after, we heard a car pull up nearby. A man shouted angrily, possibly fired a gunshot, and then drove his car directly toward our tent. We fled into the woods in our underwear as the driver realized we had pitched a tent in the middle of a small roundabout. He drove away, and we relocated in the darkness. The next morning, we woke to find dozens of school children staring at us from a nearby building, which turned out to be a summer camp. One of the staff offered us tea, and we laughed in disbelief at the chaos of the previous day. Story 28. During spring break in 2006, my high school sweetheart and I decided to try getting back together. We were both attending college far from home, she in Seattle and me in Spokane, and planned a long road trip through the American West. The first part went smoothly, including time spent in the desert near Joshua Tree. For reasons I no longer remember, we chose to cross the mountains near Lake Tahoe and decided to camp overnight before crossing the pass. The elevation was low enough to manage, with some snow on the ground but nothing unexpected. We found a random mountain road and set up camp. As we lay down to sleep, we both heard very clear footsteps crunching in the snow around our tent. I called out casually and the footsteps stopped. A moment later, they started again, closer. I shouted more aggressively, and once again they stopped. After a short pause, they returned, right outside the tent. I burst out in a panic, only to find no fresh footprints anywhere around us. Despite both of us clearly hearing the sounds, there was nothing there. We tore down camp faster than I ever have in my life, threw everything into the car, and fled. As we drove toward the mountain pass, a heavy snowstorm hit, and we were told we could not continue without tire chains. In my panic, I struggled to install them until a truck driver helped us. We crossed the pass that same night. Years later, after we had gone our separate ways, we reconnected through a mutual friend. While reminiscing, she mentioned hearing a podcast describing strange experiences in the exact area where we had camped. In that moment, everything from that night came flooding back, and I realized how deeply that fear had been buried until then. Story 29. One summer night when I was a teenager, two friends and I snuck out to explore a rural, heavily wooded area near where we lived. We followed the road for about 3 miles until we reached a small bridge over a river. It had been a rainy summer, and the river had flooded into the surrounding woods below the bridge, creating a swampy forest. One of my friends kicked some gravel off the bridge into the water, and almost immediately after it hit, we heard a loud snapping sound come from the woods behind us. I grew up in the area and assumed we had startled a deer, so I kept watching the river. But my friend shined his flashlight into the trees toward the sound, instantly grabbed my arm, and tried to say my name. When I turned and looked, I saw something that was absolutely not a deer, but a very humanoid figure. The bridge was easily 12 to 15 feet above the river, and this thing stood almost level with the bridge. Instant terror ran through me, the kind that freezes your legs and sends ice through your veins. It had no real face, just sunken eyes, and then it let out a shriek. I finally broke free from the paralysis, but my other friends were already running. I ran as hard as I could, and even though I had run cross-country for 8 years, my friend who never did any sports managed to outrun me. I heard what sounded like metal scraping on metal as whatever it was scrambled over the bridge guardrail, followed by another shriek that sent pure adrenaline through me. We sprinted all the way home. When we got back, my parents were shocked by how terrified we were and did not even get mad that we had snuck out. We told them what we saw, and my dad said he believed us and told us to go to sleep. The next morning, my friends went home still shaken, and my dad drove me back to the bridge, where we saw claw-like marks in the metal guardrail, which was bent as if something had pulled on it. Most people I have told this story to have called me a liar, even though my friends can recount it exactly the same way. About 4 years later, I went back to the bridge at night while carrying a firearm, and nothing happened. I still do not know what we encountered, and despite researching animal sounds and possible explanations, nothing has ever matched what we experienced. Story 30, I was traveling with my ex on a motorcycle through South America in 2011, and we had gotten used to camping by the roadside every couple of days. One evening in northeastern Peru, on the road to Yurimaguas, it started getting dark. So we found a quiet spot about 1 kilometer down a dirt road near a small creek. There were small villages scattered every few kilometers. In the middle of the night, around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps near our tent and then saw a flashlight. It was very hot, so we usually slept with only the mosquito net portion of the tent door closed. I was sleeping near the entrance, with my ex farther inside. I sat up, assuming someone was just walking past, but then a man approached the tent, shining a flashlight directly in my face while keeping his other hand behind his back. In slurred Spanish, he told me to get out of the tent because he wanted to rape my girlfriend. I was shocked, and by then my ex had woken up, confused and scared. She did not understand much Spanish, so she asked me what he said. I translated it honestly, told her I was not leaving her, and quietly instructed her to grab one of the knives we had used for dinner, hide it, and defend herself if needed. I then told the man to calm down and said I would do what he asked. As I slowly unzipped the mosquito net, I suddenly rushed him, punched him in the jaw, and knocked him back. He stumbled, got up quickly, and as I checked for anyone else and glanced back toward my ex, he jumped into the creek and disappeared into the darkness. My ex finally spoke and said we needed to leave immediately. I told her to grab only her essentials and helmet, and we started the motorcycle. I left behind my helmet, the tent, sleeping bags, and most of our gear, and rode back to the main road and then to the nearest village, where we found a bar with lights, music, and people inside. I explained what happened to an older woman there, and several men listened. Wanting to retrieve our equipment, I asked if I could go back, and two men volunteered to come with me, grabbing crowbars. We returned within minutes, but the tent and everything inside were gone, and there was no way one person could have packed and carried it all alone. After searching unsuccessfully, we returned to the bar. The woman offered us a place to stay, and her husband brought us to their home, where we slept safely and were given breakfast. They explained that a local holiday had caused many people to drink heavily and walk home that night. It took 3 months before my ex felt safe enough to camp again, and she later admitted she had frozen completely and never reached for the knife. I have had other unsettling experiences over the years, but this remains one of the scariest, even though nothing ultimately happened. Story 31. I was about 12 years old at a summer camp backpacking on Bureau of Land Management land in Northern California. We were a group of about 10 to 12 kids with two older counselors managing us. I was an energetic kid and had moved ahead of the group up a steep switchback trail that climbed from the river below, where we had spent the day swimming, toward a mountain camp on our way back to the main site. Some boys were not used to backpacking, so there was a lot of waiting, and I ended up sitting alone on a rock partway up the switchbacks, watching the group make their way up through the trees. Earlier, while walking from the river to the trail, we had passed a group of about 4 or 5 adults skinny dipping in the river, which got a bunch of Christian camp boys laughing and talking loudly all the way up the mountain. As I stood there alone on the slope, surrounded by scrub oak, fir, and redwood trees, with a clear view down the switchbacks, I noticed someone watching the group climb. I saw a figure peek its head out from behind a large tree, then hide again. This happened 4 or 5 times before the figure moved from that tree to another large redwood about 10 to 15 feet away in only 2 or 3 long strides. It peeked out again, focused intently on the group, completely unaware that I was staring straight at it. At the time, I assumed it was just a very tall, strange, extremely hairy man, maybe a naked hippie living in the woods and possibly connected to the group we had seen earlier. What I did not realize until my 20s was that this figure had long auburn-colored hair covering its arms and legs that flowed as it moved, and only its face had bare skin, which was mostly flat with a wider nose than normal. I watched it continue observing us until the group reached me, at which point I pulled the lead counselor aside and told him I thought someone was following us. Almost immediately, the figure peeked out again, and I pointed it out to him. The counselor saw it too, looked at me, and calmly told me not to say anything to avoid scaring the others. I agreed and did not think much of it again until years later when I stumbled across a Bigfoot sighting website and realized what I might have actually seen. I still remember that counselor clearly and often think about how much I would like to speak with him again and compare memories. Story 32. I have several stories, but this one stands out from my years as a corporate photographer. Photography was both my profession and my hobby, and while my work kept me indoors, I spent my free time hiking alone to capture landscape photos. In my 20s, I was reckless and ignored basic hiking safety, never telling people where I was going and failing to bring proper gear, driven by the idea of surprising friends and family with dramatic photos, which I now recognize as naive. In this first story, I was not alone, but with one friend who was fit but not an experienced hiker. We decided to visit Vance Creek Bridge in Washington, an abandoned metal railroad arch bridge towering roughly 350 feet above a creek and surrounded by dense evergreen forest. At the time, it was relatively unknown, and when we arrived on a cloudy, rainy November day, we were the only ones there. The bridge did not connect to the ground on one end and was accessible by climbing a corrugated metal pipe that served as a makeshift platform. We climbed up and began crossing, and the view was stunning, with clouds drifting through the trees and light filtering into the valley. As I photographed, I noticed many broken or missing railroad slats, made slick by rain, meaning one wrong step could be fatal. I also saw spent bullet casings lodged in the steel beams below, evidence that people sometimes came there to shoot. My friend became fixated on the edge, peering over and calmly talking about how everything would be over if someone jumped, saying life's problems would no longer matter. Knowing his troubled past, I became genuinely worried he might jump.